I'm Jacek. I feel so sorry. This is so early. That was their idea to actually do this presentation so early in the morning. My name is Jacek, indeed, and I'm going to talk briefly about ZK and law. Um, just a few words about myself. I'm also a co-founder at L2BEAT, like Piotr, but I promise this is the last presentation from L2BEAT this morning. But tomorrow, please come over to L2 Warsaw, which is another conference during the Warsaw Blockchain Week that's also taking place in this building, which also means that you don't even have to leave, right? It's enough that you stay until tomorrow morning and you join this other conference. So I've been a crypto lawyer for a long time, working with people like you, developers in the space, working on many different projects, more or less tech focused. I spent most of the time at MakerDAO, which is a large DeFi project, as you probably know. And I've dealt with like many legal problems that people faced with respect to the projects they built. Also in terms of like risks to the projects, risks to themselves, stemming from like different type of areas in different type of countries. Right now, I'm a co-founder at L2BEAT. This is what I said already. But one disclaimer, I am a lawyer, but I'm not gonna give legal advice. And also everything that I'm gonna be saying is gonna be about like very general topics, right? Because you guys, you come from different countries. Legal risks always stem from like specific countries. I will not focus on any specific jurisdiction. So now, the first question that I asked myself when preparing for this presentation was, why is this even relevant? Why would you care about this topic, right? About the law if you're building just using specific technology, just using ZK proofs, right? You want to do some cool things. Why would you care about legal? And I think that the answer came less than a week ago, or like a possible answer, because there are more. And that's about the indictment that faced two co-founders of Tornado Cash. For those that do not know, but I'm sure that almost everyone knows, Tornado Cash was this type of service that allowed you a kind of like a mixer, although it wasn't really a mixer, that allowed you to like obfuscate the trace of your crypto transactions in a way that you were able to get your ETH in a way that there was like no trace back, and they used ZK proofs to make it happen. So it was a privacy preserving solution, right? A solution that allowed you to keep financial privacy in your on-chain transactions, so that you didn't have to reveal all the trace of everything that you did on-chain. And many people, including myself, were using the service exactly for that purpose. But a year ago, as you probably know, the service was shut down by the US regulators. And now, 1 year later, those two co-founders, basically developers that created the solution and then ran a project that was maintaining it, they were basically charged with criminal offenses, which came after their colleague faced a similar situation in the Netherlands a year ago. So you can see that it's not just about the US, the bad US chasing people, but it's a more common problem that is also being faced by people in some other jurisdictions. So that's a very simple answer. People using these technologies for some goals that, you may or may not agree with, they are just facing legal troubles. But of course, it's not just about personal safety, right? It's not just about, because you may see some FAT being triggered, that now developers are gonna face criminal liability. It's not just about this. Of course, criminal liability is not something that just pops up at every corner. But it's also about business and scaling. So if you want your project to actually succeed and make a difference, you also need to remember about the risks that you are facing, because otherwise you're not gonna build scale. You're gonna remain in a niche, being afraid of like legal consequences, and also people will not use your product or a tech solution that you're building because they will be afraid of legal consequences. And there's also one more example that came to my mind. And full disclaimer, I'm an advisor to WorldCoin Foundation, because WorldCoin is kind of facing a similar problem, but from the other side. Look, in Tornado Cash, the problem was keeping the transactions secure and private, right? The problem was that the information about those transactions wasn't accessible. In the case of WorldCoin, I think that the concerns are quite the opposite. What happens with the data, right? The problem is that the problem is not that the data is not private. The problem is that people are afraid that the data would leak. So that's another type of problem that if you're dealing with certain like information or data, even if you're dealing with ZK proofs, that's a certain concern that people are gonna have. If this data is valuable, like in this case, biometric data, people are gonna be afraid and concerned what is actually happening behind the curtain, especially if your technology is not easily explainable. You cannot like easily explain to everyone what's going on and why this is actually private and why this is actually secure. People are gonna have concern and will try to chase you under regimes like GDPR. So now let's just take a small step back, because none of what I'm talking about is actually new. You may have heard about crypto wars in the 90s, which was basically a crackdown on strong encryption and uses of cryptography by the US government and also other governments around the world, where people were literally refused to use strong encryption because it was deemed like a matter of national security by many countries, and people were forbidden from using strong encryption technologies. Basically, this type of tech, like strong cryptography, was meant to be munitions. So it was actually, strictly regulated on who could get access to this technology, to the extent that even things like SSL, when it was first built, it was not widely accessible, and people were facing legal challenges to actually use cryptography. And I think that we are kind of like facing the same situation today. It was coming to an extent that the creator of PGP, Philip Zimmermann, at some point in the 90s, he published a book with the whole source code of PGP, just trying to build a legal argument that what he's doing is actually exercising free speech, that he's like, providing some information that should be freely accessible, that it's not really munitions or some secret technology, but, open source software that should be used by anyone everywhere, and it's just the way it should go. So those crypto wars were won. At some point, the US just removed cryptographic solutions from the list of munitions that that made it impossible to transfer, to distribute widely, especially globally. But I kind of think that, and this is gonna be something that you will face at some point. I think that right now we are going through a similar process of a kind of like a crypto wars 2.0, but applicable to transfers of value or data. Because in the 90s, it was all about communication. Like, people have problems were using technology to process information, for example, to build like encrypted email, right? That was a huge problem. That was the problem of PGP. Right now, we are seeing similar restrictions and similar problems being faced by people who want to securely transfer value, like blockchains are all about it, and also data, and especially personal data. So this is something to consider if you're involved in a project or working on technology that is making that happen, not just transfer of information or protection or privacy of information, but also of value, assets, data of some sort. This is where you should pay attention. Now, in terms of some practicalities and a step forward, right? Because at the end of the day, this is what matters. I thought about three questions that you should ask yourself. And again, this is like super general level that you should ask yourself when working on ZK technologies. What am I doing besides pure coding? Am I facilitating / making possible transfers of value or data? And what could go wrong? And I will briefly go through each of those. So here, actually, the Tornado Cash indictment offers a good overview of like what actually brought trouble to those guys. It's full of information, like this legal document where like the charges were presented. It's full of information about what those guys were doing actually, besides just writing open source software. It was like plenty of activities that brought trouble to them. And here are some just examples. They're not like directly from this indictment, but some of them appear there, and I thought that some others may be relevant as well. So one example is running a UI, and by that I mean a plethora of activities from like just publishing a website, maintaining it, like making some app available. Basically, even if the essence of what you're doing, if the essence of your product is some protocol, like for example something that is happening on chain, still if you're facilitating access, right, and if in practice people are getting access to this product via such a front end, such a like user interface, this is something that may be legally relevant for you, basically. And that was also the case for Tornado Cash, right? Of course, Tornado Cash since 2020 was like pure immutable. It was like a set of permissionless smart contracts, and yet the majority of people were using Tornado Cash website being maintained by the same guys from the beginning. Then the second thing is about getting revenue, because at the end of the day, many of those projects are just like business projects, and they need to be sustainable. So they need to have some sort of revenue, and that was another type of like fact pattern that appeared in the Tornado Cash case, because those guys, even though the protocol was decentralized and later like governed by a DAO and token holders, they were getting revenue, for example, by running relayers that like made it easier for people to use the service. So that's something to take into account as well. Then a few other things like quite similar in nature. This is basically like exceeding the role of just a developer, right? And like engaging in some other activities. Of course, if your role is just like a dev at a specific project and you're only writing software, then probably you're much more like secure or like personally safe. But then if your role is a little bit different, if you exceed that role, this is where like the analysis also change, and that may mean like participating in governance, because this like decentralized governance topic also appeared in the Tornado Cash case. It was in theory this project was decentralized and governed by token holders. In practice, those guys like were like a major token holders that exercise control over the entire scheme. It's about marketing, business development, and public representation, kind of like also public presence, like going outside and also representing this thing, right? Not just that you write this code, you just publish it, meaning that it's just on GitHub and that's it, you're always over. If you actually go out, market it, behave as if it was a business, then the situation changed dramatically. So that's something I want to like be very clear about. Tornado Cash case is not really cracked on like dev activity and just writing software, right? This is actually dangerous for the authorities that are running the enforcement, and I'm sure that it's going to be part of the legal defense. But it's about all of the other activities, so it's worth asking yourself, what is those other activities that I'm doing besides pure coding? Then it's about kind of like sitting in the middle, I would say. So as soon as you act as a kind of like intermediary, you sit in the middle, you facilitate some types of transactions, some flows of value that happen through your, I don't know how to call it, like depending what you're building, but your kind of service or your protocol, even if it is decentralized, this is where like the analysis change a little bit. And especially if there is a custody of assets or data, but custody is not like, it's just like an addition, right? Even if you're sitting in the middle, people will look at you as an intermediary and will try to build some analogies, right? And some analogies from the financial services market are like obvious, right? Financial institutions, like this is what they do. They sit in the middle, they facilitate and intermediate transactions, they bring like different counterparties together. If you're doing the same, but in like a decentralized way, then probably you should think about it, right? And this is also something that the Tornado Cash guys faced, not now in the criminal indictment, but also a year ago, when the Tornado Cash address was basically, the Tornado Cash smart contract addresses were for the first time classified or like brought into the sanction list of the US. And then also, the question is, who's the factual operator? And by operator, I mean like a very broad meaning, like a very broad definition, because it's not just about like this typical case in which you're in full control, but if you exercise this like sufficient level of control, this may just bring legal troubles to you. And of course, I'm speaking at a very high level, right? Because it will strongly depend on particular circumstances. Now, perhaps one good example that people are not really considering and I about which I've been thinking recently, is about how actually like L2s work, right? And you can visit L2BEAT.com and see about the in-depth analysis of particular L2s and how they actually operate and to what extent they're actually decentralized and what are the risks involved. And I was just wondering, I mean, from the perspective of what you can see in the slide, what's the situation of all the L2s with centralized sequencers? Right? Are those sequencers kind of operators, right? If they actually can like impact significantly what's happening on chain in this particular L2. What is that could happen, and not only in terms of like harming the users, but what if such a centralized sequencer receives an order to do something on chain, right, from an enforcement authority? So like this type of questions, I'm sure, are gonna be appearing more and more often as people realize that if they have like a certain amount of control or impact, and it's not really decentralized to the extent as like some L1s are, for example, this is where some legal topics will reappear into the conversation. And now the last question, that is probably the most practical one I could come up with, is what could go wrong, right? Because this is again the Tornado Cash case. If you know that your service may be used by money launderers and hackers to just launder the proceeds of the crime, because this is what happened, right? In the case of Tornado Cash, is that like hackers massively use the service to just launder proceeds of bridge hacks, like the Ronin hack, and this is what brought attention of enforcement authorities. If you know that your privacy protecting techniques and ZK proofs that you're using can be used by bad actors, this is certainly something that you should take into account, because if there is harm to users in some way that is happening, even if it's just the way it is, right? Because this is like an open and permissionless ecosystem, this will just bring attention to you, right? And you should have an idea on how to respond if there is such an attention. And of course, it's also about money laundering. That's what I said, but also data leaks. If your tech, for example, is not mature enough, there may be some problems, right, in terms of like the full total privacy for the users. There are some cracks that you want to fix, but still they are out there and something could go wrong. Even if it's not like strictly legal, practically speaking, that could just bring trouble to you, and that's something to think about. That's the end. Thanks so much. I know that there is a very strict policy about questions, so I'm not sure if there is time to have any.